Well, good morning, everyone. I'm David Winkles. I'm president of the South Carolina Farm Bureau, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Food Dialogues, South Carolina. Today's event is titled Balancing the Demands of Water with the Need to Grow and Raise Food. This is certainly an interesting time to be discussing ag water use, given the impacts of the drought we had earlier in the year and the historic flooding just earlier in October. This flooding, as you know, has severely impacted agriculture in this state. While you're here at the dialogue today, I hope that you'll have the opportunity to participate in both panels, one this morning and one this afternoon. Each will explore water use, especially agricultural water use in South Carolina. This discussion is possible thanks to a partnership between U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance and the South Carolina Farm Bureau. USFRA is made up of nearly 100 farmer and rancher-led organizations and agricultural partners representing the various aspects of agriculture. These organizations, in partnership with USFRA, work to engage in a dialogue with consumers who have questions about today's agriculture. We're happy to host all of you here today and hope that you leave better informed about agriculture and water use in South Carolina. Our moderator is someone many of you may know already. David Stanton is a former news anchor, public affairs program host, and political debate moderator. He's a native of Rawl, South Carolina, and he's a graduate of, as I like to say, the University of South Carolina, Clemson University, and he has a law degree from the University of South Carolina right here in Columbia. David, I'll turn the program over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and we are so glad to have all of you with us today for the Food Dialogue South Carolina. We are streaming live from West Columbia, South Carolina, and we are excited you can all be a part of this discussion, whether you're here with us in the auditorium or you're joining us via the internet with your computers or your smartphones. Today we're going to be discussing the strategies that farmers and ranchers use when they use water on their farm. We're going to look at how much water is being used and how that affects the water supply. You're going to hear from a panel with expertise in farming, ranching, water use, sustainability, and much more. And since we're streaming online, we encourage everyone to follow us via Twitter and get involved in this conversation. You can do so by joining us at USFRA using the hashtag FoodD. And you can submit questions via Twitter, also using that hashtag FoodD. We're also going to be taking questions from our audience here in the studio, and we'll be asking them to write questions down and submit the questions. We'll have people that will just hold your hand up, and people will come around and take the questions from you and bring them up to me. So we'll collect them throughout the discussion. Not all the questions are going to be addressed today, so this will be continuing on the internet at fooddialogues.com and on the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance Facebook page. We want everyone to get a chance to be heard today, and so we intend for this morning's conversation to remain constructive and respectful, even when we don't all agree. Let's keep in mind that no matter where and how we are communicating. And we have one technical note. Please keep your cell phones off or on vibrate, and if you're not using them, go ahead and turn them off. Okay, let's start by introducing the participants for today's first panel. And that panel is a closer look at South Carolina's water needs. Charles Wingard is the Vice President of Operations at Walter P. Rawl & Sons, which is located in Pelion. His primary duties include the oversight of vegetable production on approximately 4,000 acres of farmland in South Carolina, Florida, and Mississippi. Ellie Bomstein is the Food and Agriculture Project Manager at the Coastal Conservation League, where she works on advocacy for small and mid-sized farmers. Ellie works out of Charleston. Lori Rikard is the owner and Director of Operations for Rocky Wels Agri-Services, LLC, and Rocky Wels Trucking, Inc. She's also a co-owner of Rocky Wels Farms, which is located in Lexington County. The farm has several hundred acres of row crops. David Baize has been with the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control for 27 years, where he's worked as a hydrogeologist David is the Assistant Chief of the the Bureau of Water at the Department of Health and Environmental Control. And among the issues he works on is water quantity, availability, and permitting. And we're going to begin, David, with you and talk about where the water that we use comes from, that is mostly surface or groundwater, or where do we get it, and who uses the water, who's the biggest user?
Sure. Appreciate being here today. This is always an exciting time to get together to discuss water. And if you look at our water usage, then we have those statistics because that water use is reported to us every year. So we compile that information. It's very useful. So for example, our total water use in the state, about 79% used is surface water and about 21% groundwater. And that's for all uses for all sectors. And then you can break it down from there into groundwater and surface water. So for example, if we're looking at surface water usage, the biggest user is water supply, which is a little over half, about 58% of our surface water that's used.
Water supply would be
our municipal drinking water supplies, exactly. Industry uses about 30%, and agriculture about 10%.
Okay, and Charles, tell us about you, about what you do and your farming operation.
I'm part of a third generation owned and operated family farm based in Pillion. We now have our fourth generation that's come back in to work with us. We're primarily leafy greens, southern leafy greens, collard, kale, mustard, turnip, cilantro. We have a few other seasonal vegetables along the way. And I'm into family, so I get to do a little bit of everything. I have to do a little bit of everything, and I do spend time out in Mississippi and down in Florida to assist those operations. We have a fresh cut operation on site where we add value to our product and put it in the bag, and we deliver produce from Lexington County to about 30 states, kind of the easternmost 30 states in the U.S.
Okay. And what are the different ways that you use water, and where do you get your water from?
We probably use about 30% of our water, or about 30% of our water sourced as surface water, and we use water to irrigate our crops. It's important to know or understand that agriculture is very seasonal, and by that nature, if we don't need to push the button to start the pump, we don't push the button. It costs money every time we push the button, and if we can let Mother Nature help us, and to irrigate, we'll be glad to let her help us. And so we do a lot of overhead irrigation, but we've taken a lot of steps or made a lot of improvements to modify our systems to increase efficiencies.
Okay. And so you get about 30% of the water, you said, from
Surface
water.
on-farm ponds primarily.
On-farm ponds, more than getting it from riverways and creeks and this sort of thing.
Yes, I have one pump station on a creek, and everything else is a farm pond.
Okay. And Loni, tell us about your operation, where you get the water from, and what you do with your farming operation.
We harvest about 200 acres of row crops annually: corn, wheat, soybeans, and sorghum. About 50% of our crops are dry land crops that we are not able to irrigate because we don't have water available. The other 50% are irrigated, all from surface water from on-farm ponds. We also have the trucking company. We move farm products, grain, and feed commodities, and we work with farmers all over the state of South Carolina and in 15 other states across the country, dealing with them as well.
And you have the same need for water when you need it.
Right. When we need it, we need it. When it's dry, we have the ability to irrigate. We irrigate so that we can make a crop and so that we can actually return some yields on that crop. When we don't need to irrigate, we absolutely don't. It's a lot of work. It's very expensive. One of the biggest things that we try to do, and I think would be true for all of agriculture, is we try to be efficient. Not only because we conserve our water and our natural resources because it's important to us, but also because it conserves our bottom line.
Okay. Ellie, tell us about the Coastal Conservation League and what you do with it.
Sure. So the Coastal Conservation League is a 26-year-old conservation organization based in Charleston. Our main concern is protecting the quality of the environment and the quality of life in the South Carolina Lowcountry. We do that in a lot of different ways. We have lots of different program areas, but I work under the Food and Agriculture program, And our major concern there is thinking about agriculture as a way to conserve rural land. We're really worried about protecting rural landscapes in the Conservation League, and we realize that one way to do that is to make sure that there is a vibrant rural economy, and we do that by advocating for farmers, primarily small and mid-sized farmers that are providing local produce to our market, in Charleston and also around the Lowcountry. So I work a lot on policy advocacy to make sure that those small farmers are protected and benefited, by the policies just mostly in our state.
What are the different ways that people in South Carolina use water that your league comes in contact with?
Sure. So, farmers are definitely a major water user that we're really concerned with. But every member that we have and every person we come in contact with is also a water user. So that's that municipal supply that David was talking about. But we also have a lot of nature lovers that our organization represents. So those are people that, are kayakers or fishers or, hunters that need that water to preserve the landscape that they like to use for recreation.
So part of your interest is having access to the water for everybody that uses it.
Right, exactly. And when our natural landscapes are healthy and when they're getting the water that they need, that increases not only our economic activity from recreation, but also our economic activity from all the other industries, like tourism, that are such an important driver for our state.
David, how have we monitored our water use over the years?
Well, the reporting of the water used is sent to us by the users themselves. So the amount of water that each person that's registered or has a permit comes into us, and we summarize that data every year. We make that report available because that's very useful for folks in different capacities to look at. We also have some monitoring networks around the state where we partner with the Department of Natural Resources, for example, to look at water levels, and the USGS has a stream gauging station to look at surface water statistics. So there's a pretty robust monitoring network between our three agencies.
What kind of monitoring have we had legally in South Carolina over the years? Has there been an act or a series of acts that help you in monitoring the water usage?
Sure. Interestingly enough, groundwater regulation was pretty early on. In the late 70s, there was established what's called the capacity use program, where groundwater, large withdrawals of groundwater are permitted in these capacity use areas. That's typically in our coast. And those capacity use areas have grown over time now to include most of the lower coastal plain. So that was very early on. And as part of that law, then reporting groundwater usage was part of the permit. Surface water registration was one of the first pieces also that was in law. But that was just where surface water users registered and then reported that amount to us. We now have a relatively new surface water permitting law that now requires large surface water withdrawals to also receive a permit.
Tell us more about the permitting law, the Surface Water Act of 2010.
The Surface Water Act was many years in the making. There were a lot of stakeholders involved in the process because obviously the water usage is important to all water sectors, whether you're industry, water supply, agriculture, recreation, all those uses, power generation, they're all...
Conservationist.
And yes, absolutely. And the environmental community was very involved as well in drafting the legislation. But it really took several years to work out all the details. And now we have a system where new large withdrawals are permitted.
Loni, you don't have to worry about the permitting process at this point. Are you happy with the structure that's set up for the way we monitor our laws now?
I would say overall, yes. I think in the Surface Water Withdrawal Act, which is the last thing that we had, everybody came to the table, was my understanding, and agriculture was deemed an essential user. And from the agriculture standpoint, that's what we're looking for, is to be an essential user. As Charles mentioned earlier, we are seasonal. We need water during seasons when we need it, depending on the amount of rainfall. Obviously, we haven't needed water in the past several months. We've had a more than ample supply. But when we need it, we need it. And to be an essential user of water for agriculture means we have the availability. It's not like with a plant or somebody else, if water is cut off, then it hurts that business, but 2 weeks later or whenever point in time, you can crank back up and continue your operation. In a period of a drought, if agriculture does not have access to water, 2 weeks' time, you've lost everything. And so I think the way that it's operating now has been beneficial.
Okay. Ellie, what do you think about the legal structure that we have for our water usage right now?
So as David mentioned, the Surface Water Withdrawal Act was a really long process, involved tons of different stakeholders. And, they say, you have a good compromise when no one's happy. And so, I think we were really excited to see any sort of permitting and, reporting regime put in place, because it's better than nothing, obviously, which was pretty much what we had before, where people were reporting their use, but there wasn't really any mandate. And so it was definitely a step in the right direction in terms of just gathering information and, helping users understand that when you're using water, that's really something that you need to be responsible for. So we were happy to see any law put in place, but I think we're concerned about the fact that, and David can speak more to this, that the law we have is not necessarily being fully enforced, so that's a major problem. And the law that we have also allows for, a large proportion of the river to be taken up. There are a lot of scientific studies that say after you take more than 15% of the water out of a surface body, then you start losing that ecological function, which means, all of the plants and animals that rely on that water start functioning not as well as they might if the amount of water that's supposed to be there is there. The way that our surface water withdrawal law is written, we've sort of reversed that. And so we've allowed 80% of that water to be taken instead of leaving the 80% that the plants and animals need to function at the highest level. So that's one of the major issues that we see with the law. And then the other piece that's concerning is the fact that there are some loopholes and some people that maybe have different access, but that's not even as big of a problem as the fact that too much water can be taken out of the river.
Okay. David, what about the enforcement of the law?
Well, first let me point out, we implement the law, so we're going to do whatever the policymakers direct us to do through the law. So we're the implementers. So I can certainly discuss what the law does without taking any particular side in any argument that people may have. What is currently in place in the law is a term called safe yield, which then is really defined as the amount of water that's available for someone to take out of a river. And that's really what that means, and that's really all it means. And that is defined as the average flow that's in the river minus 20%. So it's not the full capacity of the river, it's just that average flow that's available out there at the point of withdrawal. And then you take 20% off of that, and that's the amount that's then available for use.
How is the law enforced now?
Well, we have a permitting staff to issue the permits. And again, we have the water use reporting, which is now mandatory. It is not optional. And we do have staff who are doing compliance assistance visits. So the law is being implemented.
Okay. Were there, prior to 2010, were there any limits on how much water a user could take from a...
No, the only limits prior to 2010 were on an interbasin transfer law. So really, another way to look at what happened is that if you had an interbasin transfer, you had to get a permit, but that was the only case. So that interbasin transfer law and the old reporting law, which just asked for surface water reporting, sort of got combined into the new law that requires then permitting or registration for users, and it's all in one place now.
Okay. And let me remind you again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can write a question out. Just hold your hand up and somebody will come around and get it from you. We also encourage those that are watching by the live stream that you can go to Twitter and go to hashtag FoodD, and then you'll be able to send in your questions, and we'll take them off the Twitter and ask those questions too. Charles, how does the structure for taking water work for you now?
Well, most of our surface water withdrawals are on-farm or from on-farm ponds, which do not come under the law. And we do have one place where we withdraw out of a creek, and we comply with the law. We are registered accordingly and report every year. I would point out that the law, I think, is a great balance. It's a great compromise between large industries all the way down to small farmers. I think the law helps small farmers more than anybody else by making the registration somewhat painless. There's a threshold in the law where if you pump less than 3 million gallons a month, you're exempt. That's right, David? So the threshold is 3 million gallons, and to put that in perspective, you cannot grow a crop of field corn on 25 acres with 3 million gallons a month. It's just not enough water to do it if you run the math. So the law really helps small farmers a lot by making it painless to get into the law, or somewhat painless to get in compliance with the law. And we think it's a good balance, it's a good compromise. We've known, I don't know where it didn't work, the law. I think it's worked everywhere that has come up.
Mm-hmm. David, how does the law affect users?
Well, it's not so much focused on the type of use, it's just the quantity amount. So whether you're a water supplier, an agricultural user, there are different requirements for those, each water sectors, but it's really focused on the amount of water being used, and the law doesn't necessarily give any judgment in and of itself as to the type of use.
Okay. Do you think that the Surface Water Act of 2010 addresses the needs of everyone, your constituencies?
I mean, as I said, I think it takes a step in the right direction, which is, again, gathering that information and making sure that users are getting a permit to not take, more than their share of the water. But again, it doesn't necessarily leave enough water in the river. And the other issue is that because the safe yield number is calculated, that David mentioned, is calculated based on the mean annual daily flow, which is, the average of the year, it doesn't necessarily reflect the way that our ecosystems work. In a lot of the rivers in South Carolina, the fluctuation can be massive. So a number that makes sense, in a part of the year where the river is really high doesn't necessarily make sense in July when that river level is really low. So it's not necessarily reflective of the way that the natural systems actually work. And that's an issue because based on that safe yield number, it would be perfectly legal to take the entire flow of a river for one person in one day. So, if you're talking about equality, it's not really fair for someone who, might have riverfront property and want to go kayaking or fishing or, take their family on the river. They wouldn't necessarily have any water to do that because an upstream user was legally allowed to take the entire flow of that river one day.
And Charles, it's not just having not enough water, but sometimes you can get too much water, as we've seen here in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, we've got more surface water than we ever had in the state, I think. That's exactly right, and agriculture now is feeling a lot of pain from the floods. We're dealing with that. We're trying to figure out a way to get the water out of the field. We used to try to get it in the field, now we're getting it out. Mm-hmm. But one thing we've done, I think a lot of people have done in agriculture, is they've figured out ways to recapture their water and recapture capture rainwater through terraces, waterways, let it filter down a grass waterway and put it back in their pond to use again, or to use in the case of rainwater. But, I want to go back to something Ellie said. She mentioned, and I appreciate her comment about wanting to help small farmers, because I love small farmers. I think that small farmers and big farmers go together like a brick wall. Let me be the brick, let them be the mortar, and if you put either one of us up without the other, you don't have anything very strong. But if you put us both up together in a good, in a good way, you got something very strong. And so I love the small farmer deal where you want to help them. And I think this law really helps the small farmers by letting them get into a registration process and not the permitting, because permitting is expensive, it's long, drawn out, and we want to protect rural landscapes too, and a law that will allow small farmers a little bit of easier way to get to the water will help preserve the agricultural landscape in rural areas. I think if you would look at a piece of land that just say 100 acres, and they use however much water on the farm, if it were developed and houses went in there, I think the water use would be greater because they'll be using water every day, yards, some swimming pools, whatever. So I think you're right on for, wanting to help protect rural landscapes and small farmers and stuff.
Are you in a position where when you get a lot of rain that you're able to take advantage of that in the way of being able to store it somewhere?
Yes, most of our farms that have on-farm ponds are, of course, they're fed with some kind of spring head or something like that, a wet feature. But we also employ the appropriate conservation measures, terraces, diversions, waterways, to get that water into my pond before I let it go somewhere else. Because in the summertime, if your pond's running low and you get a thunderstorm, it's tremendous help.
Right. What about you when you get more rain than you can use? Do you have a way to siphon off some of that, put it in a holding pond? Or?
I would say we would do the same with Charles. We have on-farm ponds, and we also follow conservation practices. We have terraces that empties the water out of the field the way we want it to go, that flows into a grassy waterway to direct it, where we need to go so that we can utilize as much of that water as possible.
Charles, is it economically smart for a farmer to use as much water as he can? And Lonnie talked about this a little bit earlier.
No. I can't speak to the row crop portion or the row crop segment of agriculture, but in vegetables, most of our crops are shallow rooted, and you may see us irrigating every other day. If you ride by my field, you'll see the pivot going every other day, but what you probably don't realize or may not understand is we may only be putting 1/10 of an inch of water out. We rarely put over 1/2 an inch of water, and that would have to be on sweet corn in July when it's right at the end trying to fill the cob with kernels. But most of our greens are, they're only about that tall, so you don't have that much plant down there, and they just don't need that much water. We spoon feed our nutrients to it, so we don't want to, and we're pretty sandy. We don't want to spoon feed our nutrients and then pile the water on and wash the nutrients away.
Okay, we got a question in. I don't know if it's from Twitter or from the audience here, but what is, and you mentioned this a moment ago, the relationship between the small farmers and the large farmers. What's your definition of a small farmer?
I don't know.
When you see it.
I reckon I would say maybe 100, 150 acres. In the case of specialty crops, it could be 5 acres or less. You can do a lot if you get into a high-value crop, flowers, leeks, or some of these herbs, legal herbs. You could get into a lot of money per acre. So, or greenhouses, something under glass. It could, small farmer could be very successful on 3 or 4 acres. Strawberries, for example.
The way that we like to think about a small farmer is somebody that doesn't necessarily have access to what's called economies of scale. So, a large farmer can buy massive quantities of fertilizer and get it at a cheaper price because, they maybe have 5,000 acres to put that fertilizer on, versus a smaller farmer is going to have to buy, less fertilizer at a higher price per quantity because, they only have 5 acres to put it on maybe. So we think of it more as sort of an economic term, and maybe that smaller farmer wouldn't have access to the major distribution channels that a larger farmer would, so they might be trying to get to the state farmers market or a different market channel. So I don't like to put a dollar value or an acreage size on what a small farmer is. I like to think about more how they operate in the marketplace.
And we were talking a little bit earlier about the farmers and how they use the water, and I think Charles mentioned this. They use the water when they need it. Y'all, I guess, understand that different users have different needs at different times of the year for water. Some industrial users might use it on a regular basis.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, unfortunately, the time when the farmers need the water out of the rivers most is the time when the fish and
everybody else needs
the
water
other
too.
users also need it because that's when the river level is low. So again, I think one of the really important things that I try to remember is the fact that all the water flowing in our rivers is something that belongs to every resident of our state. It's called a public resource. So that means that everyone legally has equal right to use that water, And, I understand farmers grow our food, and without that food, we're all in big trouble. But it's important to remember that when that water is in the river, it belongs to all of us, and it's all of our jobs to make sure that we're using it in a way that is responsible and fair and, meets the needs of all of the people and also the natural resources that we all love and care about.
Loni, what's your definition of a small farmer?
I'm kind of like Charles. I don't exactly know. I think it depends on the operation. If you've got, say, a row crop farmer like I am and growing field corn, 25 acres of corn is absolutely nothing. 25 acres of strawberries is a really big operation. So it depends on the individual operation. I kind of agree with Ellie about maybe the resources and the economic standpoint of that. I'm not sure, though, that you can exactly quantify that, in universal terms of what a small farmer would be.
Okay.
USDA has monetary
Yeah.
levels, and I don't know what they are, but like if your gross sales are under X number of dollars, you're small or whatever.
But you're out in the field every day, and you have a better idea of what makes a small farmer versus a large farmer, I think.
Yeah, and Ellie made a good point. It depends on how they market or how they're able to buy their inputs and all that. And to me, small farmers look pretty happy. They don't have the headaches like I do.
David, another question and I believe this is from the audience. Is food production considered more important than recreational water use in current regulations?
Well, when it comes to the calculations on the amount of water that's available for use, there's no distinction between different water sectors. So the law itself doesn't render any judgment per se on those numbers that are calculated for available use. It's just whether it fits within that formula or not.
Okay. And Charles, another question, I think this is from Twitter. Are there incentives, cost share programs to help farmers install more efficient irrigation or water use systems?
Yes, there are. They come through the USDA, and oftentimes they're funded through the Farm Bill. I think the most popular program is called EQIP, and I think it's Environmental Quality Improvement Program. We don't participate in it because our county FSA doesn't set our programs up for that type improvements. I think Lexington County does a lot of stuff with livestock. But there are cost share programs. For example, a pivot that's 13, 14, 15 feet tall in the air, when the water is introduced into the atmosphere, if it's put out under high pressure, that equates to small droplets. Small droplets equates to more droplets. And that would be a lot more evaporation and wind drift during June, July, August, May, the months where we have to irrigate the most. But if you were to convert that pivot to a low pressure and drop your nozzles down to about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and the low pressure would mean larger droplets and fewer of them, then you get a lot less evaporation, a lot less wind drift, and the water is introduced into the atmosphere at about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, so it's got 6 or 8 feet less to fall through the air and be subject to evaporation, wind drift, things like that. And where we've done it, I think we've noticed about a 20-25% savings or increase of efficiency. And we get a lot better, we just do a lot better job when we put drops on our pivots.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Loni, what about you? Are you aware of any incentive cost share programs to help install more efficient irrigation systems, or have you taken advantage of any?
We have not taken advantage of any ourselves. The ones that I'm familiar with are the ones that Charles has already mentioned, and I think EQIP is the most common program. I would say, it's kind of off topic a little bit from a cost share program, but like Charles said, you've dropped your nozzles, you're using low pressure versus high pressure, it makes you more efficient, you use less water, you conserve more water, it improves your bottom line. And Ellie, you mentioned earlier as far as using, the time that the farmers are using the water out of the rivers, the same time that the river is low. The farmer, Charles has been a 3rd generation farmer. I'm 6th generation on my family farm.
6th generation.
We've been there for a long time. The way that we've been there for a long time is because we do everything that we can to conserve our resources. It's in our best interest from the farmer's standpoint, not only for our bottom line, but because you want to protect the land for future generations. And technology changes. So as technology changes and you come up with better ways and better ideas of doing things, you use the technology to conserve water in other areas.
And David, I'm going to add, part of agriculture uses drip irrigation, and they're probably saving 50–60% of the water because the water's delivered about a ½ inch to an inch under the ground right at the roots of the plant. And then another part of agriculture, the fruit industry, they're using microjet irrigation where there's a small little sprinkler right under each tree. So it's automatically in the shade, and it's only a foot off the ground, and it's only watering the roots, not the foliage on the tree, as opposed to maybe a large traveler that's having to throw the water 150, 180 feet in the air or cross under extremely high pressure. So agriculture has come a long way just since I've been involved 20, 25, 30 years. They've come a long way of increasing efficiencies. We still have some things we can do, but we've really come a long way in 25, 30 years.
Ellie, you work a lot with agriculture. Are you aware of any programs or any ideas that farmers could use to be more efficient with their water use?
So I definitely, drip irrigation is something that we like to talk about a lot because it is really just the most efficient way of getting water directly to the part of the plant that, needs it and uses it. So that is definitely a great idea. Equip is another one that we talk about a lot. And this isn't something that exists in South Carolina right now, but there are lots of other states that provide incentive programs to farmers who undertake conservation practices. So, that might be a lighter permitting standard or something like that that's given to farmers that reach a certain conservation standard. And that's something that I've been doing a lot of research on because, it's rewarding farmers that are taking actions that we would want them to rather than penalizing them. And, as Loni mentioned, farmers are the original conservationists. They're the ones that are most directly affected by, how well they take care of their land. So we definitely understand that they're more in tune with those natural systems than just about anybody else because they, live or die by them. So, we definitely see that very much. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities that the state could take on of incentive type programs that reward farmers that are, extra responsible or use their resources in a really creative or efficient way. And those don't exist here yet, but they exist in a lot of other places. And I think we have a lot of lessons to learn about things that we could do.
For something like that, you'd need to go through the legislature and get incentives built into the law.
Yeah. Yes, we would.
Is that something that your organization gets involved with?
Advocacy and
Yeah.
lobbying? Yeah,
like
we have 2 registered lobbyists on staff and work a lot with legislators and, both at the state level and more locally as well to try and create policy that we think, represents the interests of our members.
Okay. And David, we talked some about the difference between the farmer's use and use by others and how the state law looks at that. Let's drill down on that just a little bit. The farmers, as we've mentioned, have to have the water when they have to have it. And if they don't have enough then it's going to could be disastrous for them. Does the state structure take all that into account?
Well, I think that's why the registration process for agriculture was really put into the law, is that there is a way to get them into the system, to get their water use accounted for, to have them registered and report their water use, but it does not have the same standards as a permit that would be issued for other water sectors. So that registration then does not have of course it does have the same standard when it comes to the amount of water that's available for withdrawal is the same. But the registration in and of itself then does not have any sort of minimum in-stream flow where they would have to stop withdrawing.
What is the difference between a large farm that needs to draw water every year versus a large industry that is drawing a large amount of water on a regular basis?
Well, I think they've already pointed out that the seasonality and the timing may be the difference, where
Right.
other water sectors would have a constant demand on the system
And they would need the
year-round,
permits.
and they would have to have the permits, versus agriculture, which would have to apply at a very much more limited schedule.
Right. Okay. Here's an audience question. What is the efficient amount of water to sustain crops, kale or corn or various other crops? Charles?
Well, that's going to vary depending on the time of the year. In May and June, July, that number's going to be pretty high. I think corn, field corn, is going to want about 1 inch of water every 3 days, right there when it's trying to fill the ear out. Sweet corn's about the same. Collard and kale is going to be about 1/2 inch of water every 3 days, 2.5, 3 days in that same time frame. And as you get into the cooler months for the greens, all that slows down a good bit. And we don't irrigate on schedule. We scout or walk the fields, and we literally pick up a handful of dirt, and if it will, and we squeeze it, and if it will stay in a clump, we not irrigate. If it falls apart, it's too dry, we need to irrigate.
And same question to you, what's an efficient amount of water to sustain the crops that you grow?
Well, like Charles said, on field corn, we usually strive for about 1 inch of water every 3 days, whether it be from Mother Nature or whether we irrigate, but that's not for the life of the crop. When the corn's starting to tassel, it's starting to make, you need more water. Once you get the ears on the kernel and the corn's more mature, you don't need the water. I mean, it's a very tight window of what you need when to make the crop be the best that it can be. And so we do the same thing. We go and we look, and we know what stage our crop is in and whether it needs water now, whether it needs water later, and we monitor it accordingly and use just the amount of water that we need, because like Charles said earlier, you turn that pump on and you see dollar signs, you know.
And Charles, I guess you need different amounts of water for the different crops.
That's right. Loni mentioned about corn. When we grow our sweet corn, we don't want to grow that sweet corn coming up very much, or we don't want to irrigate it very much right away. We want those roots to get down and find water. But once it tassels, and you're making that, in this case, it's the fruit of that corn, it's the cob, it's the ear. Once you're making that, you got to get the water on it. And it's only about 14 days, 16 days that you need the water right there. And after that, we're finished. And it's very similar in field corn. Parsley, for example, and cilantro, they grow very short to the ground or very close to the ground. Radish, those crops don't need very much water at all. They have poor root systems. They can't get a lot of water. So it is very crop specific as to the needs of what your crop needs are.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. What considerations might be given to recognize the variety or the varieties between allowable uses of water if it can be documented that some users return higher quality water than others? I guess that means that somebody that grows crops has a higher quality return than somebody that's just kayak.
I'm trying to fully understand the question. I mean, there is a difference in water use between a consumptive use and a non-consumptive use.
Sure.
So a lot of industrial users need the water in their plant to maybe cool their machinery. So, they pull that water in from the river, they run it through their system, they cool their machinery, and then they're returning almost all of that water that they use back to the river. Maybe it's a little bit warmer, and that can be a concern for, ecosystem services. But, in general, that water use isn't considered consumptive because it's going right back into the river where it came from in a lot of cases. Versus a farmer, water is a cycle, so it's all, it's not leaving the planet. But, when you water your crop, that water is generally going right into the crop and not back into the river, so that's called a consumptive use. Similarly with a municipal system, they're pulling that water out, it's going out into the pipes, it's going to your home, and then, it's going back into the sewer system and eventually getting back into the river, but that's also considered a, more consumptive use because it's not going directly back to where it came from. So, we can treat those things differently, but that's kind of the differences that I see, and I don't necessarily know if there's a way to, give them a hierarchy necessarily, but in terms of keeping water in the river, obviously that non-consumptive use has less of an impact. David, do you think that?
Yeah, that's generally reflected in the permit system that non-consumptive users have a little less burden in the permit process. But the law defines exactly what non-consumptive is for the purposes of issuing that permit, and it is a return very close to where the withdrawal was taken out. Because if you, even though you may put in, let's say if you took out 10 million gallons and you put very close to that in farther downstream, for that segment of stream, it's still consumptive at that point. So it would still be considered a consumptive withdrawal. But if you take it out and put it mostly back in very close to where it was withdrawn, then that is considered non-consumptive use under the law, and you get a little bit of a lighter permit burden.
We've talked a little bit about the formula that you use to measure rivers and how much water is being taken out and how much is a safe amount to be taken out and this sort of thing. Have there been any studies done of rivers to determine, how much, where they are now, how much is a safe amount to take out?
Well, there are a number of ways to look at that, and what South Carolina is doing right now is engaging in developing models of our 8 major basins to help get at that. In other words, the information that we've had over the years through different monitoring networks and different agencies who are all doing good, important work, that's never really put in one place at one time. And so we were allocated money from the General Assembly, $1.5 million a couple of years ago. We have a contractor on staff who's developing those models. Department of Natural Resources and DHEC are overseeing that process. You can go actually to the website, scwatermodels.com, and you can get all the information there on that process. But essentially, water models are being developed in our 8 major basins that will help look at water availability and help really pull all that information from USGS stream flow stations and everything else that we have into one place, so that those scenarios can be run then by the model, trying to understand our water needs 50 years from now. You can do those sorts of projections and look at increases in population or increases in a particular water segment like agriculture and tease out then the particular influence that those different uses have.
And when should we hear something back from that stuff?
Well, those model processes are ongoing, and they're about halfway done. So it's really a 2-year schedule to develop the models, which is very ambitious, as anybody can tell you who's dealt with models, to do basins of this scale in 2 years is very ambitious, but we're on schedule to do that. We're about halfway done. And again, if you go to that website, you can see there are stakeholder meetings that are being held around the state, two in each basin for this process. And after that, we'll then follow a water planning process where this information from the models will then be applied as DNR updates the state water plan.
And what's the website address again?
scwatermodels.com.
scwatermodels.com. Okay, very good. We've talked a little bit about this, but Charles, let's go back to it. This is a question from Twitter. Do you agree with the USDA definition distinguishing small and large farms using monetary considerations?
Not really. I kind of like what Ellie said. I hadn't really thought of it the way she pointed out, but I like what she said, and I reckon for tax reasons or something, they've got to be some monetary. They have to have something to delineate themselves. But I think Ellie's ideas were much more reasonable and much more common sense.
It's a little harder to, work that from a policy standpoint, but I think, when I think about different sizes of farms, that makes the most sense. And yeah, you can definitely understand why the USDA would need something a little harder, but for our purposes, I think it makes a little more sense. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, here's another audience question. One panelist stated that the Surface Water Act makes it easy for small farmers to register, but how does that ensure future availability of water for small farmers? David?
Well, I think, again, the process is essentially the same for anybody who has that trigger. So that 3 million gallons in any month is basically 100,000 gallons per day. So if you don't pull out 100,000 gallons a day, and the same trigger is used for groundwater. So if you don't take out more groundwater than 100,000 gallons a day, you're exempt. So you're not even falling under the law. So it's really just the larger users, although Charles made a point that that's really not a lot of water in the grand scheme of things, especially when trying to grow a crop. It does sound like an enormous amount of water, but it's really not that big an amount when you look at certain applications and what's used. So I think this whole idea of sustainability and our use of the water is really what the water planning process is going to be all about. But how do you inform that planning process? Well, you need to do it with good science, and that's what these models are for. because not only will models be developed for the surface water systems, but also the groundwater system. So if you're going to do a good water plan, then you really need to have good science and data to back that up.
Lonnie, can you give us an idea of how much water you use, like per acre or per 100 acres to handle different crops?
Well, I guess it depends if we irrigate or if it's dry and if
Right.
we have rain. Use corn. Corn is the biggest crop that we grow through the summer, corn and soybeans. Corn, for an example, 23, 25 acres of corn is that 3 million per month
Is that right?
mark. But then if you average that out over a year's time, you're not using 3 million gallons. You might use 3 million gallons a month in July.
Right.
You're not going to use that in September and October and November through the winter. I mean, we really irrigate in the summer. Well, I guess I would have to really put pencil to paper if you're going to average that out, just because it's such a short window. So, in July, we use a lot of water. We probably on our farm, during a 1 month time, if it's dry in the summer and we're irrigating everything, we're probably using 8 million gallons, probably based on what we have that we could irrigate during that one critical time. But then, like I said, we irrigate maybe 3 months out of the year for the most part.
David, how does that work under the law if you do it just 1 month or 2 months as opposed to doing
It's in any month. So if you break that 3 million gallon threshold in any month, then you come under the regulation.
Okay, you got to register. All righty. And give us an idea, Charles, of how much water it takes for you to grow, say, an acre of greens.
Well, it hadn't taken a lot lately.
The best way you can figure that.
I'm like Lonnie now. I might need to put a pencil to paper here, but if those greens are, let's talk about collards. I reckon if we transplant collards, we go put maybe an inch of water on them the first week and a half that they're transplanted to get them rooted, and then the next 2 to 3 weeks while we're growing them, we're going to put maybe a ½ inch a week, maybe a little bit more, 3/4 of an inch. And then as those collards get up pretty big, and I'm thinking of a time of the year where we're transplanting in March and harvesting in May. So that collard's getting big and it's getting hot. So then we're going to probably put about an inch a week on those collards for that last 2 weeks till we harvest them. And I don't know what the numbers just added up to, but it's about a 7-week process right there. That we would follow something very similar to that. And that's assuming we get no rain in 7 weeks.
So you would do how many acres of collards?
Well, at any one time, I've probably got 400 in the ground, 500.
Okay. So
in
if
the
you do an
ground.
inch of rain or an inch of water for the 500, do you have an idea of what that is in gallons?
Yes, sir, I do. That would be, you talking about 1 inch on 500 acres?
Yeah.
It'd be 27,154 times 500.
Okay.
Anybody?
I can't figure that quickly either. One panelist stated that the Southeast, the Surface Water Act makes it easy for small farmers to register, but how does that ensure the future availability of water for the small farmers? That's the audience question. If the issues with the safe yield as defined in the Surface Water Act were addressed, would you have any other objections to the Surface Water Act? And this is for you, Ellie.
So, I think that there's been a lot of talk about this agricultural exemption, and the part of it that really concerns me is the fact that that right is given to farmers forever. And, as we've seen, I've only lived in the state for a year, but I've listened to people that have lived here for a long time, and the weather here is changing really rapidly, and, the panel right now we're, talking about future needs for water users, and so I think, we have no idea what the climate of our state is going to look like, and, based on projections, things are going to be different, and, we can quibble about where that change is coming from, but it's really hard to argue that the climate is going to be different moving into the future than what we've been used to.
Climate change.
Yeah, climate change. So what really concerns me is the fact that, a farmer has access to a really large quantity of what's in the river right now, when we really don't know what that river is going to look like in, definitely not in 50 years, but maybe not even in 10 years. So that's another concern for me. There are also, some issues with, I guess, the enforcement, and, David, I know you guys have a tough job, but as we've talked about, there's this minimum in-stream flow requirement, and the way the law is written, if the river level drops below that minimum in-stream flow requirement, the users are supposed to switch to a different use. But I haven't really gotten a good answer from DHEC about how that information is disseminated, and is there some red siren that goes off when the minimum in-stream flow level gets hit and then everyone gets a phone call? So the safe yield is the really big issue. That perpetual water right makes me a little nervous. And then, those enforcement issues of how do we get that information to the users? Where's that transparency so that the users know, when to switch?
Well, it's a good chance to get that question answered.
I know, here we are.
David?
The existing users, so the people that have been out there withdrawing water for 50, 100 longer years, all got grandfathered into the program. And so that's very common with any new law, that the existing population gets brought into the program maybe in one way, and then new users that come online have a new process. And that's essentially what happens with the minimum in-stream water levels, that the existing users, because they were really in recognizing that they've been out there doing those withdrawals for a very long time, do not have those minimum in-stream flows applied to them. So that's for the new permittees that get brought into the system. And quite frankly, we've just not had that many since the law. We've not had any new permittees that condition would apply to yet that come into. So.
That answer.
Yeah, but there's still the concern about when that does happen. And we saw a little bit of a drought this summer that got totally obliterated by what happened early last month. But that drought condition, based on a DNR study from a few years ago, is probably going to be a little more likely. So it's going to be something that happens sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, are the numbers that you get from the study that you're doing now going to be good in 10 years or 20 years, depending on what the...
Well, I think it's a nice thing about the models is you can do those projections. So you can say, what if our population increases by 20%? You increase water usage over 20%, and you see what that does to water conditions in that basin. So that's one of the great utilities, of those models. And I guess the other thing is the way the law is structured. The Drought Response Act is another piece of legislation that's been in existence for a long time, and it really trumps the surface water permit. So when we get into serious drought declarations and we get to the highest level of drought, then actions taken under the drought law would actually supersede what's in the permitting law.
This is a question for you from the audience. Can farms or industry pump the river dry? Or are there safeguards in the body of laws to prevent that?
Well, again, it depends on who you are and where you are and when you came into the system. So if you're a brand new permittee and you will then have, and you get a permit, so let's say you're an industry, you would have those constraints where you would have to stop withdrawing at the minimum in-stream flow numbers for your segment. If you're in another segment, then those conditions would not apply.
So,
And-
go ahead.
Well, and that minimum in-stream flow number, again, is calculated off of the mean annual flow, if I understand the law correctly. And, as I said before, that doesn't always reflect what's in the river, during different times of the year because it's an annual average.
Is that
That's correct.
okay? So it would be possible for enough industry and enough.
Well, I think
Large.
you've got the theoretical and you've got reality. So in theory, if someone was registered for a certain amount and that amount was all that was out there, could they, in theory, take it all? So under the law, the way it's structured, I think the answer is yes. But you also have the realities of physical limitations that someone may have on them, where their intake is located, how deep the intake is, and so there are some limits. And of course, some amount of water that would be available is so large that you would end up flooding your field if you were to take it all. It just wouldn't make sense. You're not wanting to apply that much water. So you do have theory, I think, a little bit, and what's available under the law versus a bit of a reality check on what people would actually do under those conditions.
So one thing that we've been talking a lot about is this idea of transparency and real-time reporting. So the U.S. Geologic Survey is amazing, and they have monitors all over our rivers that will tell you how much water, you can get it immediate real-time, how much water is in my river at this spot right now. You can even get them to text it to you. So, I think one thing that is really amazing is that we do have a lot of information available to us right now, but there is a lot of information missing. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of transparency and real-time reporting and creating an environment where perhaps we knew exactly where the water was going when, so we could respond a little bit better in a situation where somebody, oh my God, all of the water from this river is gone, where to go, let's create a system where we could find that out really quickly. So that's something that we've been talking a lot about is, not necessarily moving safe yield from this percentage to that percentage to this percentage, but maybe just working more towards a scenario where we could get that information more quickly.
Charles, this is a question from the audience. What percentage of land in production is irrigated in South Carolina? Dry land production versus irrigated production? And just on your farm.
Well, on my farm, it's 100%. My land's 100% irrigated.
Okay.
But there is a lot of dry land row crop farms or dry land row crops out there. I would guess for the state, if Martin or somebody's here from the Department of Agriculture, let's let them send the answer up. And by the way, if my math is right, and if I could see my writing, 500 acres of 1 inch of water should be 13,577,000 gallons of water,
Okay.
if my math was right.
Good. Well, that's very good. I'm impressed.
That's a big if.
What about you, Loni?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question is what percentage of your land is irrigated and dry land production versus irrigated production?
We're about 50-50.
50-50. Okay. David, do you have an idea of what that is statewide?
I do not. I agree. Somebody from Department of Ag or may have a better idea of what the percentage is. I know relative to other states, our percentage of irrigated land is very, very low compared to even some of our neighboring states where it's much more irrigated acreage.
What do you think about incentives provided by the state to try to get farmers to go to more efficient ways of using water?
Yeah, I think again we would implement whatever the lawmakers want us to do. So if there were some incentives delivered, then we would be happy to implement that.
You would handle them whatever they were. Okay. Charles, how do you feel about the recruitment of out-of-state farming by our South Carolina Ag Commission? And that is a question, I believe, from Twitter.
Well, South Carolina Department of Agriculture has a goal of increasing the size of our agricultural economy in the state. I'm not sure that they went to recruit outside farmers as much as they were recruiting outside processors. For example, bring a processor from another part of the country to South Carolina and let them set up shop to process vegetables or fruits and vegetables that we can grow here. I think that was the intent of the program, I think that was the idea behind that, and it might have got misconstrued. That's at least the way I understand it. But what is wrong, I'm going to ask this question, what is wrong with recruiting people from outside the state to come in and do business here? Because we do it pretty successfully with car companies such as Volvo, tire companies such as Bridgestone and Continental, and even a plane company named Boeing. So I understand those are industries, and we're talking about agriculture, but at the bottom, the bottom line is what's the difference? So,
What do you think about that, Loni?
I agree with Charles. Agriculture or agribusiness is the #1 economic engine in this state. And, we recruit other people from an economic standpoint to come into the state. So what is the difference? What differentiates agriculture as being something that is bad to recruit for versus other industry?
So you wouldn't be concerned about being in competition for the water with large producers coming from out of state?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
What do you think about that, Ellie?
I think that the concern is that if someone, were to locate directly upstream of you and they were allowed to use a really large proportion of the water in that river, then that means there's less coming to you, and then you take, your legal share, and then the person below you has an even, lesser share. And, that's our concern, is that these large farms, are allowed to really take a lot of the water out of the river, and that just means that there's less for everyone else further along.
Well, I think like from a large farm coming in and moving upriver for me, assuming I was on the river, and you can correct me on this, even though a farm is registered, they still have to follow the same guidelines as far as the safe yield. So we would trust the laws and trust the program that could not happen, correct?
Well, this is an interesting part of the growth scenario, no matter what sector you're in. As you add more users to the system, no matter what they are, you're going to run into this dynamic of obviously more use, less water available in total. And that's why the permits are really structured about where you're taking the water out and evaluation at that very specific point. And so there are adjustments made to what's available based on upstream and downstream users. So the math is adjusted, if you will, in that safe yield number to look at any potential downstream effects or upstream effects that you would have, and that number is reduced. But obviously, the more users you have in the system, if we're only going to allow X amount to be permitted and used, you're going to continue that dynamic.
David, I want to add something too. And Ellie, I appreciate your concerns and share your concerns about the number of, or the, leaning on the resource. But if you have a creek, or not a creek, you have a river, and you get a 4,000 acre farm move in, whether it's in-state, out-of-state, it's irrelevant. There's really no different in one 4,000 acre farm with one big withdrawal than 40 100 acre farms with 40 points of withdrawal. And in fact, if the one larger farmer may be, going back to what you mentioned about economies of scale, they may be able to use the water more efficiently than the 40 100 acre farmers. And I'm not throwing off on small farmers, but I'm just trying to point out that whether you got one big pipe in the river or 40 little pipes in the river, you're still taking water out of the river. But I do share your concern. We've got a precious resource here, and we've got to make sure we manage it, all of us together, to manage it so that it's there for us in the future. We make investments based on the use of that resource, and I need years and years to get my return on investment.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, 25 acres of corn is not a good economic strategy, but you can make a heck of a lot of money, on 25 acres of specialty crop. As you well know, that's what your business model is based on. And I think the larger farms tend to, and it's hard to make any blanket statements, but larger farms tend to be the ones that are growing row crops, which generally require more water, versus a smaller crop, which might be able to be on a smaller, more sustainable or specialty crop farm that isn't going to require as much.
If you go acre per acre, your row crop farm's typically going to use less water than your specialty crop farm. Vegetables use more water per acre than row crop. So if you're looking at the same 4,000 acres, whether it's a 4,000 acre row crop farm, or like Charles said, 40 100 acre specialty crop farms, your acre per acre, your water use on specialty crop will be more.
Okay.
And I think too, Charles, you mentioned something about this earlier at the beginning of the discussion about you've got farmland and you look at how much water agriculture is using per acre. If you develop that farmland and you put houses there, you probably will have more water usage because it's continuous. And as far as, out of state or anybody else moving in and developing a new farm and needing new registration, if there's a tract of land for sale, it's going to be sold. It can go to agriculture or it could go to be developed. I would think agriculture would probably end up being the lesser user of water.
Yeah, well, and also, from our standpoint as an organization, we'd much rather see a farmer go in there, because the chances that they're protecting habitat, they're, maintaining the soil, they're, keeping that rural quality of life that we're interested in. They're not going to create as much traffic as, housing development. I think that that's definitely something we would agree with you on. And, my concern with these large farms coming in, that's kind of this boogeyman that everyone's talking about, is just the fact that, we want everyone to be using their fair share. We want to make sure that there's enough water for everyone. So it doesn't particularly matter to me if that person's growing peppers or cotton, as long as they're not taking an amount of water out of the river that's unsafe.
And we're going to let David verify that.
Yeah. Well, again, we implement the law. It sounds like we implement what's before us, and there's changes in the law, we'll implement those too.
Okay, you ask a question here and you get an answer. According to the USDA, there are 1,973 farms in South Carolina that irrigate. That's down from 2,030 in 2007. But that percentage of farms that irrigate has stayed at 7.8%. So 7.8% of the farms in the state irrigate. Here's an audience question. Isn't the real debate about priority of use of water? We have a limited supply, and we have to decide about the priority of use as we have times of stress supply. And that's what you've been talking about.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing that is important to remember is there are things we can all do to reduce our personal water use. So, there's a lot of efficiency to be gained. We've talked about drip irrigation, but, there's a lot of efficiency for personal use, and, utilities can be more efficient, individual users can be more efficient. So I think that, we can talk about a priority of uses, but that starts to get really complicated. I think one thing that we could maybe pay a little more attention to is being more efficient all across the board so that we don't have to be scrapping, and saying that food is less important than me being able to take a shower, which is a pretty difficult value judgment to make.
That's a good point. The incentive to be smart users of water falls on all of us because it's there for all of us and we all need it as we go forward. Okay, here's another audience question. How do we balance ag's need to use water during a relatively short period of time with a user that may have a small demand on a daily basis but will use water every day? David?
Well, I think it gets back to the priority question. That's sort of the same thing. Does one have a priority over the other?
Right.
And it really, the law is not structured that way today. There are priorities in the Drought Response Act if actions are necessary to curtail water use. And in that scenario, water supply and water available for emergencies and agriculture are the essential water uses that are defined in the Drought Response Act. But other than that, I'm not really aware of any priorities that are set within the law itself, because again, it's really whether it's 40, 100 acre or one, larger or whatever, it's based really on the quantity and making sort of judgments about whether making tires is better than making baby food, which is better than, so it'd be a very difficult sort of thing to do.
Much of the conversation about water farming is centered on crops. How does the framework change with regard to livestock and grazing? You're not involved in that.
I'm not involved in livestock, but I think under state law, agriculture is all treated the same. And when you get to the essential water use, the drought response, I think it goes into agriculture that provides food, I believe. But I don't think there's a difference. In my opinion, there's not a difference whether it's livestock or crops.
Yes, that's the definition of agriculture in the law is pretty expansive, and I believe it includes all that.
And don't we have a law on the books that help prevent problems whenever we do have great periods of drought, an emergency water use law, as it were?
Well, the Drought Response Act is in place, which has a very robust process, I guess, because it's got a state drought committee, which I've been on for a long time, been part of, and so there's a group of state agencies that comprise that. DNR actually administers the Drought Response Act, and then there are local stakeholders which feed into that process. So there are drought designations made per county, really, and as the drought level increases, as it gets drier, then those drought declarations are changed and updated, and it's met. And then that kicks in certain restrictions. So, for example, it may be a moderate or severe drought. Water suppliers would have to implement voluntary or mandatory water restrictions for their customers. So it's a progressive sort of process.
Okay. Next question is an audience question. Measures to increase natural water infiltration, for instance, cover cropping, no-till, can reduce the need for irrigation. Are we doing enough of this as an agricultural industry?
Yes, we are. The row crop industry has, by and large, gone all no-till, which is a tremendous increase in efficiency on their side. We do, on our farm or in the special crops industry, we do a lot of buffer strips. We do a lot of terracing, grassed waterways. We actually have wildflowers planted out in my fields, in my dry corners, and even under some pivots, so we can attract beneficials. That's a little bit getting off subject a little bit, but we do a lot to slow the water down and let it infiltrate. You know, we don't want the water running off because it's going to take something with it. We want it staying right there where we put it.
Okay, Loni?
Yeah, we do. We use cover crops, and it goes back to what I said earlier as far as technology. Cover crops is one of the things that we use, and we're constantly looking at different cover crops and different things to put in your blend, some tillage radish and other stuff that helps the water infiltrate down and helps your corn roots go down lower so they reach the water deeper under. So you use, less water, make it more efficient. We use cover crops. We use minimal. We have heavy land. We don't do no-till. We have tried that several times. It doesn't work very well in our land. We do strip tillage so that we keep a pretty wide buffer of no-till and we just till where we need to plant. And there's a lot of different things that we do, and it goes back to technologies are continually improving, and I think farmers across the board are doing everything they can to keep up with technology, to be better conservationists, to be more efficient, and preserve our natural resources and our bottom line.
Okay. Another audience question. What are your various organizations doing to prepare for climate that is becoming increasingly more variable? President Winkles mentioned the drought and recent floods. Whether it's climate change induced or not, how do you prepare for it? And Ellie, let's begin with you.
Sure. It's a big question. There's definitely a difference in what we're doing. Generally we have a energy program that's working on, renewable energies to try and stem climate change. We also have a land use program that's working to try and make sure that, in those flood zones, we're not necessarily building things that are unsafe. So, we're taking a couple different tacks. And then, in terms of agriculture, that's one of the other reasons why we really love and support our small farmers is because, they are adaptive. So if you have a farmer that's growing, maybe 15 or 20 different crops, then they can handle that change in a more adaptive way than a large farmer that's maybe growing one or two. And we definitely need those larger farmers that are growing the cotton, obviously, But I think, there are a lot of different adaptations we can make, and we want to make sure that we're supporting development of businesses that can change and grow, as we're dealing with more flood events, more extreme weather, more droughts.
Okay. Charles?
Well, we're doing two things. As far as our operation day to day, we're recycling more than we ever have. We recycle our vegetable waste out of our processing plant to feed a compost operation, which feeds my organic farm as fertilizer. We recycle our oil, BTUs, cardboard. Our trucks have APUs on them, so they don't have to, the driver, when he pulls over to sleep, he doesn't have to run the big engine, let him run the little engine, and that list just goes on and on. Now, as far as our production, we've taken a lot of production away from South Carolina of leafy greens and moved it up to some contract growers in Virginia and Wisconsin and New York, where they can produce it more efficiently. And then in the wintertime, we move a lot of production out of here when it's so cold, and we'll be in the northern central part of Florida with our production there. There's really 5 kinds of weather we can't handle: too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too windy. And we know what to do when we get into any one of those, and we're prepared for that at any time. Our big problem comes when we get 2 at one time, such as too hot and too dry. But we can handle the wind with our rice strips. But we have changed the way we do business over the last number of years to accommodate what seems to be a changing climate.
All right. Well, that wraps up this morning's panel. We're going to take a break for lunch.